The All-Terrain Personal Transport, or ATPT, was first introduced to Star Wars lore in the Timothy Zahn novel Dark Force Rising, where it was described as a scaled-down version of a Scout Walker. It would first appear visually in Star Wars media when it was designed by artist Rob Caswell for its depiction in the Dark Force Rising sourcebook from West End Games. While there would be minor variations in various subsequent appearances, basically everything recognizable about the ATPT was established here. Interestingly, the walker is pretty clearly depicted here with a single primary rectangular viewport, which matches its description in the novel as having a narrow viewport. But because this viewport was situated in a shadowed or otherwise dark painted front panel, this entire feature would regularly be interpreted as a window, or identical to a window in subsequent appearances, even possibly as early as its depiction in the 1997 Dark Force Rising comic adaptation. For my version of the ATPT, I would keep this window confusion firmly in mind. As I approached designing my own take on the vehicle, I identified two further issues that I would want to address. One is that the ATPT was meant to be a Republic-era design, but in our reality, it was designed nearly a decade before the visual style of Republic walkers would be established in the prequel films. So in my eyes, it doesn't really match that era, and the walker was meant to see continued use in the Imperial arsenal too, and I feel it also doesn't really match the original trilogy Imperial aesthetics, though it's certainly been far more broadly adapted in lore as an Imperial vehicle than as a Republic-era vehicle. So what I decided to do was to make it look Republic and Imperial as a Mark I and Mark II model, which lets me refine the aesthetics in two directions simultaneously. I can treat a Republic version of the walker as an homage to the original design of the Legends Expanded Universe version, while slightly updating the design to more closely match established Clone Wars era vehicles. I can even include a big frontal window, as this matches up pretty well with other Republic walkers, which tend to have pretty generous cockpit visibility. And then with an Imperial version of the walker, I can adhere more closely to the original intent with the window, which also jives well with me pushing the design closer to the aesthetics of the original trilogy Empire. I think splitting up the ATPT into two different versions allows me to focus on faithfully, though selectively, preserving different aspects of the Legends Expanded Universe depictions simultaneously, and it also gives me the flexibility to more naturally fit the walker into established lore. And while I'm focusing mostly on so-called Legends material, the new canon does also retain the same basic story of the ATPT originating as a Republic-era vehicle and seeing continued use into the Imperial era. What I'm about to propose is updated lore that preserves some elements of the Legends material and doesn't, to my knowledge, contradict anything outright. So let's start from the top with my proposed lore. The ATPT first saw action in the Clone Wars, where it would effectively transform a single clone trooper into a light artillery unit, immune to small arms fire, and would be an overwhelming counter to basically any infantry equivalent battle droid, as well as bigger droids like Dwarf Spider and Crab droids, and it would be more than a match for something like the 3.6 meter Octup Tara droid. So it's hard to imagine why this walker would apparently appear pretty rarely in Clone Wars engagements, but it is a big galaxy, and we can furthermore imagine that overall, slightly smaller or slightly larger vehicles might have been preferred by the Republic Army, but I could imagine the ATPT seeing significant use by platoons deployed to planetary surfaces via ships like CR-20 troop transports, which were too narrow to deploy most Republic armored vehicles, but could easily carry a relatively large number of ATPT walkers, which would perhaps be the most powerful and well-protected vehicles that this ship could deliver, dramatically enhancing the options available to these troops. I imagine that the ATPT in this form would see use through the entire Clone Wars and into the Imperial era, with perhaps very mild changes to livery and loadout. It would be used somewhat sporadically for a number of years by the Empire until it was more comprehensively redesigned into a modern war machine by Imperial research and development specialists on Fest, somewhere around the time of the Battle of Yavin. These new ATPT walkers, developed relatively late in the Imperial era, were now considered cutting-edge machines. Their advanced sensor suites enabled full operation even when the cockpit viewports were completely covered and locked, while experimental magnetically sealed frontal armor gave the pilot an unprecedented level of protection. The deployment of these walkers during a special interest retrieval operation on Chorax gave the Alliance a first-hand look at their capabilities and sparked immediate interest. These new AT-PT walkers could be deployed into combat zones within moments and were remarkably agile, even demonstrating climbing abilities. Something this maneuverable and all but immune to standard infantry-grade weaponry was exactly the sort of thing that could easily counter Alliance tactics, and so the Alliance needed to act. But to devise reliable infantry countermeasures to these walkers, the Alliance needed to capture one first. Unfortunately, AT-PT walkers captured in combat were virtually never suitable for study. Despite being piloted by a human operator, Imperial walkers still relied heavily on computer programming. They were really only as effective as the sophistication of their locomotion computers. These computers allowed a human operator to more intuitively pilot the vehicle without having to handle the complicated and tightly tuned machinery directly. This required rapid calculations for terrain scanning, balance, foot placement, and a walker never quite worked right if the original factory programming was lost. This could happen merely due to damage sustained by the walker in combat, or more frequently because the Empire was building these new AT-PT units with emergency switch operated failsafes that irreparably scrambled the walker's locomotion computer in the event of imminent capture. The Alliance would need to capture a mint condition AT-PT, one that was never deployed and thus never had its emergency auto scrambler armed. This effectively meant that to study the original programming of an Imperial walker, the Alliance needed to capture a walker that the Empire never anticipated losing in the first place. In this case, directly from the facility that developed them on planet Fest. The successful extraction of these walkers was of course overseen by Rogue Squadron and was quite the humiliation for Moff Searden. The AT-PT would not be an abundantly common sight in many major subsequent battles between the Empire and the Alliance, but lessons learned from the captured AT-PT walkers would be applicable to countering all Imperial walking vehicles. What the Alliance lacked in material and manpower against Imperial armor, they could partially overcome with good intel and training. Ultimately, the AT-PT is a pretty interesting vehicle. It occupied the crossroads between the soldier-centered battlefield adaptability of the Clone Wars and the rigid control and overwhelming force preferred by the Empire. So when applying these worldviews to two-legged walking vehicles, it's no surprise that the Republic tended to prefer the lighter and more sprightly walkers, and the Empire tended to prefer the heavier and more terrifying walkers, but I can easily imagine the AT-PT being nonetheless remarkably useful to both governments when employed correctly. At any rate, that's my approach to the AT-PT. I think that my updates to the design and some slight reinterpretation of the lore not only reconciles the visual inconsistencies or confusions surrounding it, but I also think it helps it feel more like a natural part of both the Clone Wars and Imperial eras. It is a strange little walker with a surprisingly complicated history, but with the right framing, it becomes an interesting bridge between the two different philosophies of warfare between the Republic and the Empire. I hope you guys enjoyed seeing my take on the AT-PT. I had a lot of fun with this one, and I hope to be making similar content in the future, so make sure to stick around for that. I would like to thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.